Most people who survive a war spend the rest of their lives trying to stay as far away from another one as possible. But Andrew John Peters made a very different choice. After serving in Afghanistan as a U.S. Army infantryman, he returned home to Wisconsin alive. He had already seen combat. He already understood fear, death, and the psychological weight of war. He had done his duty, completed his service honorably, and could have spent the rest of his life far away from the battlefield. But when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, something inside him changed. Thousands of miles away from the front lines, Andrew watched the war unfold with a perspective most Americans could never fully understand. He spoke Russian. He spoke Ukrainian. He followed the conflict closely. And unlike most people watching the war through television screens and social media feeds, Andrew could understand the voices coming directly from the ground. Then, in late 2022, he made a decision that would permanently alter the course of his life. He packed his own military gear, left the United States, and traveled alone into one of the deadliest war zones on Earth to join the fight against Russia's invasion. What makes this story so haunting is that Andrew Peters was not naive about war. He was not chasing adventure. He already knew exactly what modern combat looked like. He knew what artillery could do to the human body. He knew what fear sounded like at night. And yet, despite knowing all of that, he still believed he had one more mission left to fulfill. In the months that followed, Andrew would call his family from Ukraine and describe scenes so horrifying that even his father, a veteran of the Persian Gulf War, struggled to process what his son was witnessing. Then suddenly, the messages stopped. And days later, the family received the news they had feared the most. To understand why Andrew John Peters chose to return to war after surviving Afghanistan, we first need to understand the kind of life that shaped him long before Ukraine ever appeared on the world stage. Andrew John Peters was born on October 12, 1994, at Fort Riley, Kansas, a place deeply connected to the history of the United States Army. In many ways, the military world surrounded him long before he was old enough to understand what it meant. His father had served during the Persian Gulf War, and discipline, duty, and sacrifice were not abstract concepts inside the Peters household. They were part of everyday life. As Andrew grew older, those values seemed to shape him naturally. Friends and family would later describe him as intelligent, focused, and deeply principled. He was the type of person who believed that doing the honorable thing mattered, even when it came with personal risk. That mindset would eventually define every major decision he made. Only 4 days after turning 18, Andrew left home for Army training. While many teenagers his age were still trying to figure out what they wanted to do with their lives, he had already committed himself to military service. He entered the United States Army as an infantryman and was eventually assigned to the legendary 101st Airborne Division, one of the most respected combat units in American military history. In 2014, Andrew deployed to Afghanistan. For many soldiers, combat changes everything. The romantic image of war quickly disappears once the reality sets in the exhaustion, the tension, the constant uncertainty, and the awareness that death can arrive without warning. Andrew experienced that reality firsthand. Although little is publicly known about his exact missions overseas, what is clear is that Afghanistan exposed him to the harsh psychological weight carried by infantry soldiers operating in active combat zones. And yet, unlike some veterans who try to completely separate themselves from military life after returning home, Andrew never truly disconnected from that world. After receiving an honorable discharge in 2016, he returned to Marshfield, Wisconsin. On the surface, his life appeared calm and stable. He enjoyed hiking, played hockey, and spent time with friends and family. But even in civilian life, many of his interests still reflected the mindset of a soldier. He worked around firearms and ammunition, repaired weapons, and remained deeply interested in military affairs and global conflicts. What made Andrew particularly different, however, was his fascination with languages and cultures outside the United States. He taught himself Russian and Ukrainian, eventually speaking both fluently, along with French and some German. That detail may seem small at first, but it reveals something important about who he was becoming. Andrew was not simply studying languages for curiosity. He was building a connection to a part of the world most Americans barely understood. As tensions between Russia and Ukraine escalated over the years, Andrew followed events closely. Unlike millions of people who depended on translations and headlines, he could listen directly to Russian and Ukrainian speakers, understand their emotions, their fears, and the growing instability spreading across Eastern Europe. Then, in February 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And for Andrew Peters, the war was no longer just another international headline on a screen. It became something deeply personal. For Andrew, the invasion of Ukraine was not distant noise from another continent. It was a moral crisis unfolding in a language he could understand, among people whose voices he could hear without translation. As cities were bombed, civilians fled their homes, and Ukrainian soldiers tried to hold back a larger invading force. Andrew saw more than a geopolitical conflict. He saw a nation fighting for survival. That understanding slowly became a decision. By late November 2022, just after Thanksgiving, Andrew left the United States and traveled to Ukraine carrying his own armor and military gear. He was not going as a tourist, a reporter, or an observer. He was going as a trained infantry veteran who knew the risks and still chose to join the International Legion in the fight against Russia's invasion. But the war Andrew entered was very different from the one many outsiders imagined. Ukraine in the winter of 2022 and early 2023 was a battlefield of mud, snow, artillery, drones, shattered villages, and exhausted soldiers. The front lines were not clean or cinematic. They were brutal, confusing, and often invisible until the first explosions began. Men could spend hours under shell fire without ever seeing the enemy. Positions could be lost or retaken at terrible cost. A single road, tree line, or ruined building could become the center of a deadly struggle. Andrew had survived Afghanistan, but Ukraine confronted him with another kind of war, a grinding industrial conflict where artillery dominated the landscape, and survival often depended on seconds, cover, and luck. Still, he stayed. And through phone calls and messages, his family began to understand just how severe the situation was. Andrew spoke most often with his father, a veteran himself, someone who understood that soldiers do not always say everything directly. But even through those conversations, the horror was impossible to hide. Andrew described the suffering he was witnessing, the destruction, and the human cost of the war around him. That detail is one of the most important parts of his story, because Andrew was not watching war from a distance anymore. He was living inside it. He could hear the fear in people's voices. He could understand the language of those defending their homes. And every day on the ground seemed to reinforce the belief that had brought him there in the first place, that standing aside was not an option. But the closer Andrew moved to the reality of the front, the more dangerous his world became. By February 2023, the war in eastern Ukraine had reached one of its most punishing phases. Russian and Ukrainian forces were locked in brutal battles across the Donbass, with heavy casualties, constant artillery fire, and little room for error. Foreign volunteers like Andrew operated in an environment where experience mattered, but experience could not guarantee survival. Then, around February 11th, the messages from Andrew stopped. For his family back home, silence became the first sign that something was wrong. No update, no reassurance, no brief text to say he was safe. Just the sudden absence of a voice that had been reaching them from the war zone. And in war, silence can be more terrifying than any message. For the Peters family, those days became a waiting room without answers. Every hour without a message carried a different kind of weight. At first, silence could be explained by the conditions of the battlefield. Phones die, units move, signals disappear. Soldiers go dark for operational security. In a war zone, not every delay means disaster. But as the days passed, the absence became harder to ignore. Andrew had remained in contact with his family throughout his time in Ukraine. Even when the situation was dangerous, there had been some sign of life, some small connection across the distance between Wisconsin and the front lines of Europe. Now, that connection had been cut. For a family with military experience, the fear was sharper because they understood the possibilities. His father knew that soldiers sometimes disappear into chaos before official news reaches home. He knew that combat does not always give families clean answers, clear timelines, or immediate closure. Then came the confirmation. Andrew John Peters had been killed in combat in Ukraine on February 16, 2023. He was only 28 years old. The final details of the battle that took his life have not been fully disclosed publicly. That uncertainty is important. It reminds us that many stories from this war remain incomplete, hidden behind operational secrecy, destroyed communications, and the fog of combat. But what is known is enough to understand the weight of his final choice. Andrew had already served his country. He had already gone to war once. He had already earned the right to stay home, to build a quiet life, to hike the trails of Wisconsin, to play hockey, to live far from artillery and trenches and shattered towns. Instead, he chose to go where he believed he was needed. His death became part of a larger and painful reality. Foreign volunteers from different countries were entering Ukraine not because their governments ordered them to, but because they believed the war represented something bigger than borders. For Andrew, that belief was not abstract. It was personal, moral, and ultimately fatal. And perhaps that is why his story carries such force. He was not a man pulled into war by conscription. He was not sent by an official deployment order. He saw what was happening, understood the danger, packed his own gear, and walked toward it. That decision does not erase the tragedy. It makes it even heavier. Because behind every headline about volunteers, offensives, and casualties, there is a family waiting for a message that may never come. There is a father listening to the silence. There is a hometown trying to understand why someone who survived one war would choose to enter another. And in Andrew Peters' case, the answer seems to return to the same principle that guided his life from the beginning. Some people believe honor is not measured by safety, but by what they are willing to risk when others are suffering. That belief carried him from Marshfield to Afghanistan, from civilian life to Ukraine, and finally to the battlefield where his journey came to an end. But the meaning of that journey did not end there. It remained in the questions his story leaves behind. What makes a man who has already survived war decide to return to it? What kind of conviction becomes strong enough to overpower fear, comfort, and the instinct to stay alive? Andrew John Peters could have remained in Wisconsin. He could have lived quietly, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of home. No one would have questioned his courage, because he had already proven it. No one would have demanded more from him, because he had already served. But Andrew seemed to believe that service was not only something written on a military record. To him, it was a responsibility that could return when history placed suffering in front of him and asked what he was willing to do. That is what makes his journey so difficult to forget. He did not choose the easy road. He chose the dangerous one, fully aware of what it could cost. And in the end, that cost was his life. His story is not just about war. It is about conscience, sacrifice, and the haunting line between duty and destiny. Andrew Peters chose a war that was not officially his because he believed the cause was worth the risk. And whether people agree with that choice or not, it remains the defining truth of his final chapter. Before Andrew Peters went to Ukraine, he already knew what war could do to a person. He had already seen combat, already survived Afghanistan, and already built a life back home in America. But when he saw another nation fighting for survival, he believed staying silent was not enough. In the end, he made a choice that would cost him everything. But what do you think? Would you have made the same decision Andrew Peters made? Would you leave behind safety, family, and your own future to fight in a war on the other side of the world for something you believed was right? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see more real stories about soldiers, foreign volunteers, and the human side of modern warfare, subscribe to Military Schedule and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video.